The South African Medical Research Council says the census that was carried out by Statistics South Africa in 2022 may actually have overestimated the number of people in South Africa. So instead of our population being around 62 million people, in fact, it may be 61 million people. The authors of this new report also suggest the census may have miscounted people by their age. In other words, it may have overestimated the number of people over the age of 50 and underestimated the number of young children in our society. The census, of course, is used by Statistics South Africa and government agencies to determine the allocation of resources and to plan for the future. You can imagine trying to work out how much money you're going to need to spend on education in, say, 5 years' time, if the number of children you need to teach is actually far more than what you've been told. Professor Nancy Stiegler is a demographer in the Faculty of Natural Sciences at the University of Western Cape. She works for the United Nations as well. Professor Stiegler, good afternoon to you. This is a big claim by the Medical Research Council that Statistics SA might have got this wrong by an entire 1 million people. I mean, obviously there'll be a lot of investigating to do, but could something like this have happened? Could it be that wrong?
Good afternoon, Stephen, and thank you very much for having me this afternoon. It is a big question that you're asking me right now, and a burning one, fresh one as well. Thank you very much. Listen, I would like to start by saying that we have two institutions here that are excellent institutions. Stats SA is a really good national statistical office, and the Actuarial Science Center at UCT. It's also a very, very serious and one of the best demographic institute, especially for estimates, for modeling. So we have now two very serious professional institutions that are looking at data. The first thing that we owe them is, first of all, to give them a little time to understand why they differ so much and where they differ so much. You know, it is quite, I don't know if easy is the right word, but quite common to get to different results depending on the methodology, the methods you have used. So if you ask me, the South Africa census 2022 was perfect? No, and we know it. Stats SA was the first one to say so. Was it undercounts? Yes. Now the question is going to look at how they have corrected the undercount, where the undercount really happened. We do not have the same problem if we have an undercount a little bit everywhere in the country, or if we have really pockets of undercounts. So these are really different problems. At this stage, we cannot really say, if we don't see the data and if we don't work with the data, where is the truth? Where exactly are the big undercounts? Are they big undercounts? And how the new estimates have been made. Another thing is that a census is never, ever, nowhere in the world perfect. We always have, in general, undercounts. And we know how to deal with it. We have many methods to manage to correct this undercount, be it in number of people, as they did, saying we are not 61 but 62, or in the age structure and the age distribution, or even the geographical distribution, or the sex distribution. This is then looked in general by the National Statistical Office with experts, and then we can really start to work with data that are probably not perfect, but that are based on very strong methodology, using previous censuses, using previous surveys, using sometimes, depending on the country, really sometimes when you lack a lot of data, we use the neighboring countries, for instance. So there are a lot of methods to be able to really correct the data and to be able to work with the data.
So, Professor, I think it might help. Just explain to me what an undercount is in this context. Because an undercount to me would suggest that we haven't counted enough people. And when you say that the undercount was, I think, 31%, That means nearly a third of the country wasn't counted. What exactly, in the statistical terms that we're talking about, what is the definition of an undercount?
Okay. When we go to the field, we have to go from household to household, and we need to count everybody in the household. It happens sometimes that for some reason we jump a household, we forget a household, or we cannot reach, for instance, a village, or we systematically forget babies. In some countries it happens where we tend to forget babies, or where we tend to forget females, which is not the case in South Africa. So this is then where the undercount is coming from. Either the enumerators didn't manage to reach some areas, people didn't want to answer, or we forgot some people in the households. So it can be at different level, and it depends the type of undercount. What happened in South Africa, we tend to know that the data collection was tricky in some specific provinces. We know that in the Western Cape it was quite problematic, and that many people didn't want to answer. Why? I still believe to that date that the fact that the census was done very quickly after the pandemic, Stats SA did not have enough time to do a proper advocacy and communication campaign where people could understand, because the census is not natural. We need to explain to people why you will need to answer to the question. We have only one every 10 years. It gives us plenty of time to forget. So if you don't have a very strong advocacy and publicity campaign, there's a great chance that the census is not going to be as easy as it is when everybody is aware and is prepared to answer.
Okay, so Professor, here's the other thing I don't get, right? How do you know what the undercount is? How do you know how many people you didn't count if you didn't count them? I mean, it seems like magic to me.
Yeah, no, this is absolutely natural and this is absolutely normal. So we have different type of methodology. The first one is we look at the previous census, we look at surveys, and we see, for instance, I'm going to make it very basic, but let's say that in this village, 10 years ago, there was 2,000 people, and out of a sudden, there's only 100 people. Then you might know that there is a problem. And then you have to check if it's really an undercount or if there was a mass migration, for instance. So that is the first thing. We use the previous data we have to look and to compare. The second one, which is done by Stats SA and which is recommended as the best international practices, is to run a post-enumeration survey, where you are going to rerun a part of the survey, a part of the questionnaire, on a specific part of the population that is randomly chosen, let's say 1 or 2%, for instance. And then you are going to compare and say, listen, in this area, which is representative of the other areas, I know that I forgot 5% of the people, or my post-enumeration survey is telling me so. But we always have to be careful that the post-enumeration survey can also be faulty. So this is when, with the census, the post-enumeration survey, the previous data, we look at everything and we can understand if we have really forgotten some people.
So, okay, that makes it a little less magical and a bit more understandable. Thank you. But that said, if you've got an undercount of over 31%, and one of the important things that Stats SA said at the time, you were right, they were the first ones to point to it, and others did, that it's sort of the highest of recent censuses in the world. If you've got such a high undercount, doesn't that immediately show maybe you shouldn't publish the data in the first place? And I have sympathy for Stats SA here. Let me just say that they kind of had to do this. I think they were forced to do it when they did. I don't think they wanted to. I don't think they had the resources to do it properly. So I have sympathy for them, and we don't yet know who's right and who's wrong, and I think the argument will go on for about a year. But if you, just as a general rule, if your undercount is 31%, I mean 31% of people weren't counted directly, doesn't that mean you shouldn't publish the data?
Again, I didn't see the data. you know, when you have 30% of the population that was not counted, in general, you hear it. We're not talking about 1%, 2%, 3%, 10%. That would mean entire cities, entire villages that would be totally forgotten, which is quite hard to. It's not a matter of believing, but it's hard to believe. So far, I couldn't say really, you know, who's right, who's wrong with 31, but 31 is quite a number. Indeed, probably one of the highest in the world, that if it's true. Now, again, and I believe that StatSA has said that it was not the case. So, again, I think this is more a matter of methodology than a matter of straight undercount.
Okay, so
do we have a matter of, a matter of undercount and then of data quality on some specific data or some specific variable? It's also possible, but 1/3 of the population who's not been counted at all seems to me quite strange.
Yeah, unlikely, I suppose. The other problem, Professor, and I mean, these things are complicated for ordinary people like me, but what worries me now is that we now have the one set of data which comes from Statistics South Africa. We now have these, you know, the South African Medical Research Council, you made the point, they're both world-class institutions. And I don't know, as an ordinary South African now, who to trust. And I worry that this argument will go on for a long time because it's very technical. Technical is a nice journalistic word for complicated. And what that means is that actually, I don't know, as I speak to you now, if we have 61 million people or 62 million people. And I don't know if government is able to plan for young children in the future. And I worry that this argument will go on for years.
I think that it's going to be a bit hard to say, but between 61 and 62, we are still looking at the population the same way. We're not talking about a difference between 40 million and 60 million. The government has many data sets that they can work with. They are going to look at the previous surveys. They are even going to look, even if it's also not perfect, but at the civil registration. So we are going to jump back to the civil registration over the 2 or 3 years, and we are going to look at the number of babies that are born. Here as well, we know that we might miss some, but when you compare the two, we are going to manage to get very close to the truth. So I think that people should not be too worried. And you know what? Because there is really a will in the country to do good. And that's the most important. There is no story of data manipulation. There is no story of misusing the data. I can tell you one thing is that StatSA has really followed the basic census rules and the international guidelines. So in terms of monitoring, evaluation, all these steps, they really have done what was supposed to be done. So with all the data set that we have, we are not a country without data. We have data. We would have such a problem in a country like Mali or Niger, for instance, which is really missing data. That would be problematic. But South Africa is strong enough with the data to be able to manage to look at the estimates and to make modeling to rerun some type of methodologies, etc., to be close to the truth. So that shouldn't be too much of a problem for the policy and the planning. Of course, if we find that really the census has been underestimated and then when corrected, overestimated, then we are going to have to say, we have to take the data, but we know that we have to compare and we know that we have to correct them when we are going to allocate the resources, to know how many schools we need to build, where are we going to build an hospital. But we have many data, and we have also admin data, a lot of administrative data to help.
Professor Nancy,
and we can integrate all of this.
Professor Nancy Stiegler, close to the truth may be a motto for our age. Thank you very much indeed. I really appreciate the time. Professor Nancy Stiegler is a demographer in the Faculty of Natural Sciences at the University of Western Cape, works for the